Welcome to our panel discussion on the state of the American mind. The fact that you've shown up here proves that you have minds. Whether they're American minds remains to be seen. I want to begin by thanking Susan Ariano, the publisher of the Templeton Press, for commissioning my colleague Mark Bauerlein and myself to edit and compile this volume. I also want to say a special note of thanks to mark the passing of our good friend, Dr. Jack Templeton, whose idea was to do this book. Jack Templeton, as you may know, died recently, was the head of the Templeton Foundation, who I knew somewhat, and it was my great pleasure to know him. He was a person of deep and serious, and this book came out of a very deep and abiding about the state of America as a cognitive, intellectual enterprise, because he understood, as I think many of us in this room do, that America is a nation founded on ideas, that American citizenship depends upon intellectual clarity and engagement, and a sense, a grasp of the nation's founding principles. We are born Americans, but in a sense we become Americans through our education and our experience, and through the way in which we embody the principles of the founding in our lives in a variety of ways, in the fabric of our lives. So a note and a nod of appreciation to Jack, and now to the subject at hand. I'm going to begin by reading or quoting a sentence that may be familiar to many of you. It's a sentence that I grew up with in my ears. A sentence written by my father, the late Saul Bellow. I hope I may be forgiven for beginning this way, because yesterday was his 100th birthday, and he's very much in my mind. I am an American, Chicago-born, and go at things as I have taught myself, freestyle. Now the sentence goes on, but I won't quote the whole paragraph. The reason I bring this up is that that sentence was written by an immigrant, somebody raised in the slums of Montreal, Russian, Yiddish, French, and English as an afterthought. But he became an American, and he was a Jewish writer, he was a 20th century writer, but above all, he considered himself to be an American writer. And in his breakthrough novel, The Adventures of Augie March, he crafted a statement of what he considered to be I think, the quintessential American sensibility. And he spent the rest of his life elaborating upon that and exploring what it meant to be an American, to have an American mind. And I think, increasingly in the latter part of his life, when I came along and became not just his son, but in a way his student, which was a privilege he shared with me, and I shared with him, his concern about the direction of the country and what was happening to America. Was America still America? And one of these, the focus for him was, because he was a writer, on the state of reading. Did America, what did they get out of it? It wasn't just a question of whether the novel would survive in any recognizable form, but whether the literary public would survive. And for him, there was a real connection between the idea of a literary public and the idea of America as a republic, as a self-governing society in which every person had a responsibility to think through certain foundational issues and questions for themselves. Now, I want to just turn to the introduction to this volume, which was co-edited by myself and Mark Bauerlein, and I want to thank Mark for carrying the ball on much of this. So some of the sentences that I'll read are his. Some of them are also de Tocqueville's. You can decide for yourselves whose are better. Hector St. John Crèvecoeur wrote, "The American is a new man who acts upon new principles. He must therefore entertain new ideas and form new opinions." Tocqueville condensed the American way into a personal standpoint, quote, "To accept tradition as a means of information and existing facts only as a lesson to be used in doing otherwise and doing better, to see the reason of things for oneself and in oneself alone." We go on to say, Emerson science and instructed his countrymen, "Nothing at last is sacred but the integrity of your own mind." I can't help feeling that The Adventures of Augie March is an expression of this very American sensibility. Now, what is the American mind? In our introduction, we acknowledge that the American mind is something with a history. It wasn't fixed and static. It has certain characteristics that we have just identified. But some of the major themes that we find are consistent in the mind, the American mentality, include independent thought and action, thrift. These are models on Ben Franklin, who we feel is the epigon of the American mind in its original manifestation. Independent thought and action, thrift and industriousness, delayed gratification, equal opportunity. But as well, the American mind possesses specific knowledge, not just an attitude. You must remember the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Bible, along with stories of the first colonists, the founding, and the pioneer experience. We find economic liberty to be fundamental constituents of the American mind. Popular sovereignty, the idea of limited government, the preference for local control, individualism, a commitment to individualism, balanced by a commitment to civic virtue and participation. These are all qualities. These are all qualities that we assume American mind. Not working. Thumb on this thing? Yes, I do. Okay. Still working? Good. So these are the ingredients of the American mind and character. Now, we skip ahead to the question of, well, are we still Americans in the way we think? And if not, why not? What's happened? And our point of departure is for this discussion is the wonderful book, The Closing of the American Mind, published by Alan Bloom in 1987, in which Bloom summarized what he considered to be the threat. Hello? Yes, okay. That's a good thing this isn't live. Yes, and I'm being given instructions. Let go of Mike. And what should I do? Should I step to the podium? Can I just go and speak? Ah, okay. You see, the integrity and industriousness of the American mind, which I do not exemplify. Hardly. I was a student of Alan Bloom's. I was privileged to know him personally very well. He wrote The Close of the American Mind at my father's kitchen table in Vermont, fueled by bottomless cups of espresso and French cigarettes. And I had been his student, and I was very familiar with his arguments and his point of view. And when he was preparing to publish the book, which I had read, I said, "Well, Alan, you know, what will happen? Do you think anybody will pay attention?" And he said, "It'll be just like the trial of Socrates. I'll be accused of disrespecting the gods and corrupting the youth." And that's exactly what happened. But I never saw him enjoy himself more. He had the entire country at his feet as though he were teaching a seminar, a national seminar. And he put himself forward gladly and bravely to engage and do battle on behalf of what he considered to be the essential American outlook, and which he identified. The book was about the threats to this American mind, this way of and being that is American, and primarily he found the threat in European imperialism, multicultural movement, which questioned the value of the Western canon, the Western heritage, and the value relativism that descends from the European materialist tradition. You know, what was clear was that there was a certain amount of the most interesting reaction to me, and it was I have to say it was the reaction to Bloom's book that started me on my career as an editor, a book editor, someone who has been publishing books now for 26, 27 years, and has always been interested in bringing out these issues. There was a lot of simple incomprehension. What is this man talking about? And that in itself was very revealing. It showed how far we had come from the integrity of a common culture and a common educational heritage. Now it's 30 years later or thereabouts, and Bloom's concerns have been borne out. There is we are farther and farther away that I think most of us in this room would recognize as a unitary culture, something that is recognizably connected to the founding and the American tradition. The American literary and cultural and philosophical heritage is practically lost, and so we come as a sort of as a rear guard, which is I think where conservatives like to be ultimately. To look back and to look squarely at where we are, and because we feel that Mark and I and Susan in discussing pursue this project, we decided that it was very important to get an accurate picture of where we are as a society, as a culture, and that we wanted the book to be based on facts and knowledge, quantifiable information to the extent that it can be quantified, and to begin by giving an accurate picture of the state of the American mind. So we gathered together a wonderful group of contributors, all deeply versed in their fields of specialty, and we asked them to contribute from their perspective an essay explaining what they see happening in their field of specialty. One of the great privileges and the fun part of doing a book like this is the opportunity to bring some of these people together and actually talk, have a conversation about our common concern, what we're really trying to get at here. So, what we're going to do today, we have 4 of our contributors, including Mark, my co-editor. I'm going to introduce each of our participants. They'll each give a short presentation. We'll have a conversation amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. I hope that people will be engaged. I will, Mark. For those of you who don't know him, Mark Bauerlein has a PhD in English from UCLA. He has taught at Emory University, and has served as director of the Office of Research and Analysis at the National Endowment for the Arts. He's senior editor at First Things Magazine and the author of a number of books, including The Dumbest Generation, How the Digital Age Stupefies Young Americans and Jeopardizes Our Future, or Don't Trust Anyone Under 30. And you don't even have to read the book now. Mark's contribution is after a magisterial essay by E.D. Hirsch, the author of Cultural Literacy, and what every American needs to know. And we asked back on the publication of that book, the reaction to it, and to give us a sense of where we are today. I'm going to ask Mark to give us a little sense of what Dr. Hirsch had to say, but I also want to ask him to talk about the subject of his essay, Cultural IQ, a provocative formulation, and I'd like to ask Mark to tell us what he means by that.
Thank you, and thanks to AEI for hosting this. When I was at the Arts Endowment, I came to AEI many times and sat in a chair in the back silently, and it was an education. So what is cultural IQ? Cultural IQ is simply the amount of knowledge you have about things in the world, past and present, things beyond your immediate circumstances, your personal lives, your social lives. So it's not abstract reasoning, which we often identify with IQ, and the IQ tests are often questions such as where you get a series of 4 or 5 numbers and then you have to pick the next number based on some kind of numerical pattern. Cultural IQ really has to do with the content of your mind. What are the things that you're familiar with? Again, beyond your immediate circumstances. And for the American context, it becomes how much American history do you know? How much do you know about government? How much do you know about current events? How often do you find your mind drifting beyond your personal circumstances to address a bill pending before Congress? How much do you know about the history of American literature, your literary historical knowledge, and so on? And these things are measured by the exams that we have. For example, the National Assessment of Educational Progress exam in U.S. history and in civics. It also is measured by reading exams, such as the ACT exam and NAEP, for 12th graders, in which you get passages and you have to answer questions about that passage. And those passages often contain knowledge, information about faraway things. And the more you know about the subject matter of that passage, the better you will perform. That said, where are we on this? Well, I imagine I don't have to rehearse the disappointing scores that we get every time the NAEP is administered to 12th graders in particular, whereby and then when they take the U.S. history exam, roughly 50 to 55% of 12th graders score below basic. Call that an F on that exam. In civics, it's not as bad in civics, but still to get C scores, we have to go up into roughly 1/3, the top 1/3 of the people. When we look at the reading exams, the SAT, with all those passages, the SAT reading scores now are the lowest they've been in 50 years. The SAT writing scores, where you're given a topic and you're supposed to write about them, the more knowledge writing will come off. SAT added the writing exam decided to add it in 2005. Ever since then, scores have gone down every single year except 2 years when they were flat. So we find the measurements of that cultural knowledge, cultural literacy, we're seeing no improvement in spite of all the money that has poured into primary and secondary education. When we look at IQ tests, the IQ scores have been going up during the 20th century. The IQ test began, many of you know, 80, 90 years ago. They were administered by the U.S. Army in order to pick out those who were intellectually talented to be leaders, to be officers. They were then transferred over to the schools where they were used, and the SAT originally was the Scholastic Aptitude Test, not Scholastic Achievement Test, but aptitude became a bad word over the 20th century, and so it's now just the SAT. They were used in college admissions to try to pick out those intelligent students who might have the advantages of other students. Now, IQ scores, broadly speaking, have been going up, so that if you took an IQ test in 1950 and you scored 100, which means half of the people who took higher, half or lower, so it's a normed exam each time. If you scored 100 then, today you would score 85. Okay, that tells you how roughly a 15-point if you scored 100 today, you would have been about 115 back in 19. There we have, the American mind is getting better, more intelligence. Well, the thing about the IQ scores is the test is actually a composite of many subtests. And so you get subtests which test, one is coding, one is similarities, whereby you might get some questions that show you pictures of different patterns. Some are shaded, some are white. You have to pick the next picture, right? So you have those abstract reasoning questions. There we see gains for children and adults of 15 to up to 23, 24 points. Huge gains there. When we go to the areas in which there is cultural, real-world knowledge involved, such as information, one of the subtests, information, how much do you know about the world, how much have you retained from what school has taught you, there we see a far lower gains taking place. In vocabulary, we see much lower gains for children. We want to know why so many children go into remediation when they go to college, why they flunk those first-year courses in freshman composition and basic English. It's because their gains are very low. They have gained, but when we look over the last 50 years, we're not seeing the big 15 to 23-point gains for children. We find that vocabulary has only gone up 4 points. Now think about how much more early childhood schooling we have, how much more money has pumped into education in the 1960s with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, for instance. This has to be a huge disappointment. So many material resources have supported raising that vocabulary IQ for kids. No. Now adults have gained a lot. They're up to 15 points. That's because more of them go to college. Okay? It only happens after they become adults. More of them go to college. So there we see some progress. Although just a quick note on arithmetic, not abstract reasoning, but basic calculations. Adults have grown since 1953. I want to know why math literacy is so low. That this is a measure of that. Children have only gone up 2 points in math IQ. In terms of information here, information is the biggest measure of cultural IQ on the IQ exams. Adults have gained 8 points. That's not too bad, and we can attribute all the media, the news, all the websites, the digital age, which just pours, and the more higher education pours information into adults' head. Children have only gone up 2 points, 2.1 points over that time, in spite of, again, all the media and education at their the more we move away from abstract, hypothetical, reasoning, critical thinking skills and toward knowledge that has to do with your country, your history, the literary and artistic, political, past and present, we're seeing steep, more gain, but the bar is slightly. And again, we have to put that in the context of all of the money and the technology access that we have today over 1950. And so this is a sore disappointment, I would say. Thank you.
So, Mark, in Hirsch's essay, he makes a point that that the shift towards a skill-based educational curriculum, from moving away from a knowledge-based curriculum, has produced several generations of students who neither know anything nor can think. How does this make you feel about the future of the country?
Well, the critical thinking skills approach to the curriculum says we want to teach, again, the capacity to analyze, to evaluate, to reflect. It really doesn't matter what materials we're applying this to. Shakespeare, well, okay, you can do critical thinking. You can do critical thinking upon that too. Now, what is the advantage of this curriculum? It ends all of the old, troubling culture wars questions of the 1980s and early 1990s. We don't have to talk about dead white male written works of literature. We don't have to have the old traditional versus contemporary debate, which everyone came out of feeling tired and distressed over. We're going to neutralize the content of what we teach. We're going to neutralize our media. We're not going to say some things are good. We're not going to get into that. No one came out of that debate happy. So the critical thinking I'm saying was a tactic for getting out of old cultural debates that teachers didn't like. We're giving critical thinking gives teachers freedom to do what they want. School districts can largely do what they want. We're going to make standards that don't say demonstrate knowledge of the early colonial history. No, we're going to say demonstrate the capacity to evaluate historical materials. Right? That is a very apolitical approach to knowledge. That, I think, is just the genesis of the critical thinking approach?
So in our in the larger context of the book, there's a good deal of focus on repeatedly on youth, American youth, because they are in many ways have been formed. The several generations of young people have been formed by changes in educational policy, changes in the general culture, technology, and general social and cultural attitudes. And so we keep coming back to this again and again. The shorthand conclusion is the situation is good. The state is not good, and it's incumbent upon us as clear-sighted social observers to be very frank about this. Now, I have to confess, we're not long on solutions. We will try to engage that, and it is our hope that we'll be able to engage this group of people in beginning a conversation about where to go from here and what we can do. One of the things that Mark raises in his essay on cultural IQ, and this will come up again and again, is parents and children need to engage with each other more. Parents should sit and read the newspaper with their children. There needs more dialogue and discussion between the generations, rather than allowing children to sort of pay attention to themselves and their peers. We'll come back to this in a later section of this discussion. Now I want to shift to introduce Daniel Dreisbach, who is professor of public affairs at American University here in Washington. His PhD is from Oxford, and he has a JD from the University of Virginia. His research interests focus on the intersection of religion, politics, and law in the founding era, and he's the author or editor of 8 books, including Thomas Jefferson and the Wall of Separation Between Church and State. Daniel's essay is on the decline of biblical literacy. Again, I'll mention my father. My father was first to the New Testament at the age of 9 when he was in a tubercular ward in Montreal, and he was given a copy of the New Testament by missionaries, and it had a tremendous impact on him. Later in life, when I knew him, he always had a copy of the King James Bible open on the coffee table in the living room, and he read from it continually. He read aloud to me from it all the time, so I grew up with a very lively sense of the importance of the Bible to American culture. Notwithstanding that my father was a Jewish writer, he drew tremendous amount from the Bible and also the language of the King James edition, as well as has been a fountainhead of American culture and values. So I'm going to ask Daniel to talk to us a little bit about about the significance of the Bible in the American founding, in American history, and what its loss or displacement means for us today.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just say, in response to what you've said, I'm generally about the English Bible, but I think in the American experience, it really is the King James Bible that has had such a profound cultural impact. I've been teaching college students now for a quarter century, and I'm not very good in picking up on big sort of trends among my very small sample of students. But there is one trend that seems just very, very clear to me here in the classroom. My students and the students that I encounter as I travel around the country are increasingly religiously and biblically illiterate. Long gone are the days when I could mention in class something like a Damascus Road experience or a coat of many colors and assume that my students would know what I was talking about, let alone knowing the source of these allusions. Those days are gone in my experience. But let me just say, biblical illiteracy is not only a malady of our students, it's something that afflicts, I think, cultural elites as well. Let me give you a couple examples, or at least one example. On April 1st, 2013, the New York Times issued the following of an article on Pope Francis's first Easter message, and I quote here from the Times: An earlier version of this article mischaracterized the Christian holiday of Easter. It is the celebration of Jesus' resurrection from the dead, not his resurrection into heaven, end quote. Well, that's not real reassuring about among the cultural elites. Contribution to the volume. I asked two questions. First, why did biblical literacy matter to past generations of Americans? And second, does it matter to us today that Americans are increasingly biblically illiterate? The response is yes, I think it matters a great deal because the Bible has informed diverse aspects of our culture and our national identity. And it continues to influence them in innumerable ways. Just to put it very briefly, to understand ourselves and where we come from, I think we as Americans must learn about the Bible. Let's recall that the Pilgrims, followed by the Puritans, came to these shores in order to build commonwealths, Bible commonwealths. That is to say, polities that were based on Protestant Reformed theology and biblical law as they understood and interpreted that idea. They were a people whose beliefs, their values, their culture was shaped by the book. And perhaps more important, it informed how they and subsequent generations have thought of themselves and their place in the world. The first laws that were crafted in British, this is true both in Virginia as well as New England, exclusively on Mosaic law. Unless there be any doubt, these codes often included references to specific biblical authority for the legal provisions that they were writing into their laws. For centuries, the Bible was a central text in American education. Take a look at the New England Primer. It brims with content. The Bible, especially the King James Bible, was a highly effective for literacy education. And the Bible reading culture in British North America enjoyed the highest literacy rates in recorded history. And increased literacy in turn promoted education more generally. And an educated citizenry was essential to the founding generation's bold experiment in republican government. Given the impact of Christianity in the Bible and Western civilization, an educated mind must be acquainted with the stories, the themes, the claims, the symbols of Christianity and its sacred text. In advice to his son, John Quincy Adams had this to say, and I quote, "To a man of liberal education, the study of history is not only useful and important, but altogether indispensable. And with regard to the history contained in the Bible, it is not so much praiseworthy to be acquainted with it as it is shameful to be ignorant of it," end quote. Adams knew well that the Bible had informed the language, the letters, the arts, and other components. Absent the King James Bible in particular, the English-speaking world would known, at least in the way that we think of it today, would not have known Milton's Paradise Lost or Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress or Handel's Messiah, the Negro Spirituals, or Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. From the Pilgrim Fathers to the Founding Fathers, and even to the present day, the Bible's played a foundational role, I would argue, in shaping American national identity, in crafting a sacred national mission, and defining the nation's place in the world. Let's look in particular at the Old Testament accounts of bondage, exodus and liberation, a promised land, and ultimately nationhood have acted as powerful formative metaphors on American self-identity. Americans have embraced a specific narrative about themselves. This is a narrative rooted in the Bible, a narrative about a chosen people who, like Israel of old, were led miraculously out of bondage into a promised land flowing with milk and honey. And this is a narrative that was not only a part of the Puritan culture, as we're well aware, but it remained a part of the narrative in the American founding era or so of the 18th century. This national narrative has imbued Americans with a sacred purpose, the inescapable implication of being God's new chosen people in a new promised land was that there was something extraordinary, exceptional, if you will, about America's place and role in God's unfolding plan for humanity. America's role as God's new Israel has carried with it both blessings and burdens. Among them a responsibility to be a model polity for the world, a shining city on a hill. The themes of bondage, exodus, and liberation prominently in the abolitionist campaigns of the mid-19th century, and they found similar expression in the civil rights movement a century later. Political theorist Wilson Carey McWilliams had this to say, and I think it really captures the point I want to make here. He says, the increasing unfamiliarity with the Bible makes it harder and harder for Americans to understand their origins and their mores, or to put words to their experiences. Lacking knowledge of the Bible, Americans are likely to be literally inarticulate, unable to relate themselves to American life and culture as a whole. A biblical literacy and an awareness of the Bible's place in the culture of the American founding not only enriches one's understanding of the nation's history, but also provides insight into the identity of the American people and the values of civil government and law. And let me just conclusion, in an increasingly fragmented society in which citizens lack a common language to engage in social discourse, there is an apparent need for shared points of common cultural vocabulary that will facilitate meaningful communications across various social divides, especially on volatile issues like religion and politics. Religious and cultural literacy lifts barriers to communications in a pluralistic and democratic society and helps citizens to join in conversations about how best to order public life and how to govern ourselves. Given the Bible's pervasive cultural influence, the continuing influence of Christianity in the modern world, and the often contentious nature of religious controversies, biblical literacy is vital for effective and efficient communications and valuable social engagement in a pluralistic society. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. One of the passages in your essay that I think is most relevant and important, I mean, as I sit and listen to you, the question that comes to my mind is, well, in an increasingly secular society, how do we make the case? I mean, I read the Bible in the Old Testament in Hebrew as part of my Jewish education. I then read it again many times and had to go back to it and also to the New Testament in the course of my literary, because as you point out, you cannot read Milton or really any of the great Western works of the canon without knowing some knowledge of the Bible, without having some knowledge of it. Even a song like Turn, Turn, Turn by Pete Seeger draws upon on an ancient biblical text. So it's not a partisan issue that the civil rights movement, a leftist movement, drew inspiration from the religious substrate of religious belief in the sense of everyone being created equal in the eyes of God. But you have a passage here that I thought was very very instructive because it goes beyond the of literary concerns, and you say there are many movements, developments, and conflicts at home and abroad, although not exclusively or even primarily about Christianity, are difficult to comprehend. This includes controversies involving civil rights, abortion, definitions of marriage, homosexuality, origins of life, and without the biblical framework underlying those issues as they have unfolded in American history, people will not fully understand each other. So how, this isn't a question that you have to answer alone, but I think it's a question that we must take up. In a society, in a culture that has increasingly, at least in our culture, that has become increasingly secular. In what world back up to the primacy of the Bible as a secular, in effect, as part of our secular education?
Well, I think it's essential to an ongoing civil conversation because, yes, we're an increasingly secular culture, but there are certainly large segments of the population that are still very much biblical culture. biblical ideas inform their worldview. And if we could just broaden the conversation a little bit beyond American shores, that's certainly true in the world we live today. Christianity is exploding in certain parts of the world, especially in the global south. And if we want to have conversations on these highly contentious issues, we're going to have to be aware of the source and origins of some of the ideas that these people bring to the table. And so it's incumbent on I think on us as educators, whether we're religious or not, to be aware of biblical ideas and to teach them in our classroom, not as a exercise in proselytizing, but simply as part of the mission of education.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to introduce Nicholas Eberstadt, who I think is well known to people here. Nick is one of the pillars of this institution, one of the grown-ups around AEI. He holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at AEI. He's a senior advisor to the National Bureau of Asian Research, a member of the Visiting Committee at the Harvard School of Public Health, a member of the Global Leadership Council at the World Economic Forum. He's a busy person. His books include The Poverty Rate and A Nation of Takers, America's Entitlement Epidemic, a subject that he will elaborate on for us today. The title of his essay in this volume is America, American Exceptionalism and the Entitlement State. And to sort of, my question is, how has the rise of the state affected what we think of as the traditional American mind, and what habits of mind have been lost? What new habits have been substituted for them?
Okay. Well, Adam, thank you very much. And Adam and Mark, can you all hear me? Okay. Thank you very much for including me in this volume. I'm really happy to be in with this all-star cast of intellects you've put together, because I think this volume is going to have legs. I think this is a keeper, and I'm really happy to be part of it. So thank you.
Thank you.
When I was a young man, I was a little tiny bit of an authority problem, and one of the things that I was skeptical about when I heard my olders and betters talking was how things were when they were young. And so I suppose I had a little bit of an intuitive suspicion of the sort of what we might call the good old days argument. What I'm going to try to share with you in the next few minutes are some empirical facts about the way in America has changed during the period since I was a boy, since I was a young, because I can show you that things have changed with respect to the relationship between the citizen and the government in a truly revolutionary fashion. Revolution in the literal sense, meaning overturning the old previous order. And I think I can also suggest by some of the homework that I'm going to share with you that in our quest to deal with poverty and need, we have also inadvertently created some new problems that people didn't have to contend with back in the good old days. Okay? So just to start with kind of like a very schematic comparison of myths. Myths may have some truth in them, but they're kind of myths. There's a European myth about poverty, and there's an old-fashioned American myth about poverty. And the European myth about poverty is that people are poor because they are trapped in the station of their birth, because of the class-ridden, mobility-lacking nature of the sorts of places that a lot of Americans wanted to get away from, or at least our ancestors wanted to get away from to come here. The American myth about poverty is very, very different. Is that we have a land of self-reliance, we have opportunities, that people with willpower and gumption and grit and courage can rise from any station to any other station in life, and that poverty has something with what we could parse out as the deserving poor and the undeserving. The deserving poor were to be helped, and the undeserving poor might be pitied or might be encouraged to change their ways. There are very different approaches to looking at the poverty question. So the important thing to know is that our modern welfare state in the U.S. traces its origins back to Europe. Its grandparents and antecedents come from Bismarck's Prussia and from interwar Sweden with its third way policies, and from the thinking of Lord, later Baron, William Beveridge and his social insurance report in the middle of World War II to promise a welfare state to the British if they'd keep on fighting, to have something to fight for. And we had this transplanted onto our soils. We kind of came late to the social party. As late as 1930, we had a smaller social welfare state than we had in 1990, 40 years earlier. But we did a party and we joined it with a bank, and I'm going to show you a little homework on this and also see what some of the implications might be. Okay, so this is a little map which tries to show the proportion of income coming from entitlement programs by county, for populations by county. Where the color is darker, the proportion of entitlement social welfare program in personal income and overall personal income is higher. You can see where Appalachia is. You can see where some of the Native American reservations are. You can see where the Deep South is. But just the darker the color, the higher the proportion of total income coming from social welfare programs. So this is 1969. I'm going to show you, I'm going to fast forward 40 years. Just look at the contours and the colors. 69, 2009. 69, 2009. So part of what we're seeing here is a revolution in government. When I was a boy, back when I was a boy, the federal government devoted less than $1 in 3 to social welfare programs. It devoted over $2 in 3 to things like national defense and the post office and retiring the federal debt and things that you might see in the Constitution, and also things that more traditionally might be described as government. Today, the federal dollar goes 60 cents out of the dollar to social welfare programs. So we have had literally a revolution in the financing and attention and priorities of our federal government and of our governmental system. But if we look a little further, we're not going to do an eye test here. Just trust me, it's in the book. Buy the book. You'll see the chart. Over the last 30 years, there has been a 20 percentage point jump in the percentage of Americans living in homes that get one or more government benefit. And almost all of this jump has been due to recipients of means-tested benefits, which is to say, benefits that one qualifies for by dint of being declared needy or ineligible for poverty-related programs. As of now, over 1 person in 3 is receiving at least one government benefit predicated upon being poor or impoverished. And this is quite striking when one considers that over the intervening 30 years, the unemployment rate has not gone up, the educational level has gone up, and the overall income level has gone up. So we have twice as many people proportionately being qualified as poor today as we had 30 years ago despite these trends. We have defined poverty and need upwards. So, in theory, public benefits are supposed to deal with poverty. Public means-tested benefits are supposed to deal with poverty. So one might perhaps think that there would be some correspondence between the ups and downs in means-tested benefits recipients and the poverty rate. But if one thought that, one would be very wrong. Because as you can see here, when the poverty rate goes up, the proportion of Americans getting means-tested benefits goes up. When the poverty rate goes down, the proportion of Americans getting means-tested benefits goes up. When the poverty rate goes up again, you see where I'm going on this. This is just the poverty rate. Look at unemployment also. When the unemployment rate goes up, the proportion of Americans on means-tested benefits goes up. When the unemployment rate goes down, the proportion of Americans on means-tested benefits goes up. If you put these all together and do a little bit of simple statistics, you'll see that we have virtually no information value given to us by the business cycle with respect to the recipients of means-tested benefits in America. There is one wonderful predictor, however, of how much of America will be taking and accepting means-tested benefits, and that is the calendar year. With every additional calendar year, the predicted number of Americans on means-tested benefits goes up 0.3 and 0.4%, between 3 and 4 percentage points per decade. And on this trajectory, we are on to have a majority of Americans on means-tested benefits in the not-too-distant future. So there are consequences of this revolution in our country. And I'm not going to make immediate connections there. I'm just going to make correlations here, and correlations can be mischievous. But one big trend that has coincided with the explosion of means-tested social benefits has been the exit of men from the workforce. You'll see up here that this blue line indicates the proportion of prime working age men, 25 to 54, who are completely out of the workforce, neither seeking work as unemployed or employed. It's quadrupled since the beginning of that fraction of American prime male workforce, has quadrupled since the beginning of the war on poverty, a very striking change. One thing also to note, these trends have been true for all ethnic groups in the United States. The exit from work for African American men has been higher than for non-Hispanic white men, but the trends are exactly in the same direction. And by the way, the proportion of white men who have opted out or are not part of the workforce today is higher than it was for African American men just 40 years ago. 40 years ago, you could have made the argument about racism and discrimination for African American men seeking work. It's harder to make that argument for white men today. And by the same token, we can look at how the U.S. compares to some of the welfare states. I've got Greece and the U.S. up here for prime working age men in their late 30s, and I cut it off in the 2008 crash because things got pretty snaky after that. But there's a big gap. There are twice as large a proportion of prime working age men in the United States who are completely out of the labor force in the 80s and 90s and 2000s as in Greece. We talk about the 5-week and 6-week vacations that people have in Europe, and it's great. But a strangely large number of American men have 52-week vacations. Finally, one thing which may be a temptation and a corruption for some is to take disability benefits. What this chart shows with the blue line is the risk of dying during working ages between 18 and 65. We're healthier than we've ever been before. The red line is the proportion of the workforce that is accepting disability benefits. That's higher than ever before. What is wrong with this picture, please? Maybe this can tell you something about behavior and norms and how this has changed. To conclude, we've talked in the public square over the past many years about our endangered middle class in the United States. And we've talked about globalization We've talked about skills, and we've talked about public policy and how ungenerous it is, and about many other things. One thing we haven't talked about is the phenomenon of applying for and accepting benefits that are supposedly based upon need and poverty. With 35% of the American population accepting poverty-based, need-based government social benefits, do we see an additional threat to the middle-class mentality? I submit to you that it is probably very difficult at one and the same time to maintain the notion that one is a traditional Tocquevillian, self-reliant member of the American middle class in good standing, and also to go out and seek poverty-based benefits. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. So what would Ben Franklin say about the state of public virtue in this country?
Well, I have to not say the first thing that I thought when you asked about Ben Franklin and public virtue. But
Something.
I think we're pretty, do what I write, not what I do. When poor Richard and his almanac would have had some pretty woeful writings and some pretty wonderful aphorisms about the wayward American dependent today. Now, of course, the American myth that I mentioned was a myth. I mean, it's partly true, and the European myth is partly true, but it's a way of kind of like organizing norms and precepts and aspirations and objectives. And one of the things that poor Richard, I think, would probably bemoan the most is the death of the concept of the deserving and the undeserving poor. The idea that everybody could qualify for public assistance simply on the basis of a judgment-free eligibility criterion, I think would have been absolutely anathema to Ben Franklin, and not just to Ben Franklin, to all of the Puritanist traditions that we've found in our heritage, even among people who weren't Protestants. I mean, there's a very, very strong streak of Puritanism even among American Catholics, among American Jewry. That probably, I think, would be my guess.
Well, I'm sure you're correct. I mean, I would just mention that what I think everybody here knows, which is that in the founding generation, and for at least a century or more thereafter, there was a clearer sense that the health of our society and of our government depends on a certain amount of virtue in the citizenry. That's the idea of a republic. And so what we're really talking about from the point of view of the founders, using their moral vocabulary, is corruption, the corruption of the body politic. And I think one of the things that you touch on in your essay that you didn't really bring out in your talk is the corrupting tendency of a massive state that views the citizenry as a clientele, a body of clients. And they measure the effectiveness of how well they're doing their job by how many people they serve, like McDonald's. And it's all very well for McDonald's to serve 2 billion hamburgers, but for HHS or the welfare bureaucracy to serve me as a client, as opposed to helping me to learn how to fish, let's say, that has a corrupting tendency. It gives me it has a moral effect, and the question is there any way to, at this point, I'm very hopeful in your essay. To you, it seems that we've gone too far. Is that how you feel?
I think the inadvertent consequences of the attempt to alleviate need are very, very stark in America today. And if you look at how modern social welfare states have been, to some degree, reformed or to have their effects or have their characteristics overhauled. Usually that has happened when the government has run out of other people's money. Right. So it happened that way in New Zealand, and it happened that way in Sweden, and there are a couple of other examples we could mention. We're a very, very rich society. The government's going to have to run through an awful lot of our wealth before we hit the wall, I fear. And to, whether it's good news or bad news, in addition to our fantastic national wealth, we for now have the dollar as the sort of the international means of exchange. And as long as we do that, we've got additional lines of credit that we can call upon. The piper finally has to be paid. Unless we as citizens wish to do something different from what has occurred in other social welfare states and preclude or begin reforms before they're only forced upon us by exigency, we're going to have a national discussion and a national consensus about that.
So we have to go broke, in other words.
That's the way it's happened everywhere else. But if you believe in American exceptionalism, we can do it differently.
Well, a note of hope, how uncharacteristic. Thank you very much. I want to introduce Jean Twenge, professor of psychology at San Diego State University, author of numerous scientific publications and books entitled The Narcissism Epidemic, Living in the Age of Entitlement, and Generation Me, Why Today's Young Americans Are More Confident, Assertive, Entitled, and More Miserable Than Ever Before. A parade of cheerfulness. The title of Jean's essay is The Rise of the Self and the Decline of Intellectual and Civic Interest. I'm particularly interested in this. I have children in their 20s. I will refrain from commenting on what I might think about that. What interests me, Jean, and I want to hear everything that you have to say about this subject, but I was very struck by the contrast between what Americans meant by individualism in the past and what they mean by individualism today. I think that's a very interesting focus for our discussion, but I want you to go ahead and just talk to us about what your findings are.
Okay. All right. So that's the cover of Generation Me. No, that is not my stomach. I just have to clear that up. That's the Narcissism book. That great part was actually reflective. It was a mirror, so you could see yourself on the cover of the book about narcissism. So that was fun. Yes. So how has our culture changed? We do have increasing individualism, more focus on the self, less on social rules, less on the group. However, this is perhaps a different type of individualism than we had in the past, as Adam just mentioned. It doesn't seem to be the rugged, independent individualism that we may have associated with the past, such as good old John Wayne here. That's sadly maybe not what we're doing now. What we're doing now is more like this. Twitter, reality television. That's Paris Hilton wearing a shirt with Paris Hilton on it.
And is she taking a selfie at the same time?
Well, we have the selfie right underneath her. You get the idea. One way to put this is that this is kind of delusional individualism. The idea, which is very common now, that thinking you're great is just as good as actually being great. Or the idea that self-belief is enough. And if you think, oh, I don't know if I've heard that. Well, believe in yourself and you can do anything. It's just one example of a phrase that's very common now. Or very common in children's sports leagues. Everybody gets a trophy, the participation trophy. You show up, you get the trophy. You sit on the bench, you get the trophy. You suck, you still get the trophy. My nephew has one of these, a pretty big trophy. It says excellence in participation. What does that even mean? I'm not even sure. So how has this affected individuals? This is our cultural change. What effect has this had on actual people? There's a really great survey that's been done since 1966. It's enormous. 9 million people of entering college students. And among the questions, they start this way: rate yourself compared to the average person your age. So if you're choosing highest 10% or above average, you're saying, yeah, I'm better than other people in this trait. So we were particularly interested in things that dealt with skills. and around kind of agentic, individualistic characteristics. So, well-known social psychological effect here that these are going to vary in how highly people rate themselves, how inflated or not inflated the views are. So you're going to see a lot of variation based on traits. Things that are considered to be easy or subjective tend to be rated higher. Things that are more objective and difficult, lower. What I want you to focus on is the change from the entering college students, the boomers in 1966, compared to the millennials or Generation Me, and the data is very recent, just from this past fall in 2014. So what percentage believe that they are above average in their intellectual self-confidence? Well, a lot more now. Social self-confidence, drive to achieve, leadership ability, public speaking ability, writing ability, which many college faculty would challenge. Right, Mark? Math ability, artistic ability, and general academic ability. Well, some change more than others, but they have all gone up. Okay, what about actual performance? Mark mentioned some of this. The SAT verbal is down. It only looks small because the scale there, that's more than that's about a half a standard deviation or more. Math hasn't changed a whole lot, and the total has gone down primarily because of the verbal. Mark mentioned this too, National Assessment of Education. Here we're looking just at reading and math, the basics, and they really haven't changed very much, as he said, in spite of all of the money that we've poured in. Point here is actual performance, unchanged or down. Self-belief, way up. Okay, we thought maybe, is there a way to quantify this cultural belief in thinking that you're great and positive self-views? Well, we realized that the more subjective feedback that students get from their teachers might be a good way to look at that. So this entering college student survey asks about their high school grades. Well, here's the percentage who were coming into college with an A average. Used to be less than 20%, and now it is more than 50. You see the same exact pattern
I'd be afraid to ski down that.
Yeah, exactly. High school students, you see the same thing. So it doesn't have to do with college selectivity. In fact, more students go to college now. So these numbers should go down instead of up. Okay, maybe they're working harder to get those good grades, but they're not. That's pretty much unchanged, the percentage who do 10 or more hours of homework. So here's the question. Has that inflated sense of self and thinking you're above average crossed over into something that not necessarily clinical narcissism, but there's a personality trait called narcissism, an inflated sense of self, or as my 8-year-old daughter defines it, narcissism is when you fart and say, "I rule." So, she's right there. She's laughing at her own joke. And she came up with that herself. It is a more toxic form of positive self-views that tends to be correlated with problems in relationships, problems of relating to others. So we did a meta-analysis of about 100 samples of college students, about 25,000 of them, who completed a measure of narcissism, the NPI. Just so you get a taste of how this measures narcissism, here's a few of the items. If I ruled the world, it would be a better place. I love that because there's always a few people who laugh and the rest of the room is going, of course it would be. Why is that funny? I can live my life any way I want to. I think I am a special person. And notice this is something that's very common in our culture, to tell kids you're special. Presumably to build self-esteem, it's actually narcissism. I like to be the center of attention. I have a natural talent for influencing people. So manipulativeness in the trait as well. We're working on updating this right now, so we've got it through 2009. Here is how college student scores have changed since the early 80s on narcissism. Okay, well, how big is that change? Back in the 80s, about 17% answered the majority of the questions in the narcissistic direction, and now it is about 30%. So it's not most of them who score at this more problematic level of narcissism, but there's almost twice as many who do. And that makes the change look even bigger than it actually is, because those are the ones who end up in your office. And they're the ones who, when you tell them you're not as great as you think they are, will tell you you're wrong and then go to the dean. And that's usually where the problem begins. All right, thank you very much.
So I would like to add something to what you've said, because as a parent, I find this very interesting. You know, and also as somebody who works in business, I've encountered, and I've heard from many people of my generation that the young kids coming out of college today display these generational tendencies. What doesn't seem to get mentioned is, whose fault is this, if not ours?
Exactly. And I think that's a really crucial point because people say this to me a lot. They're saying, well, why are you blaming this generation? It's not their fault. It's their baby boomer parents. Well, I don't know. In my view, I don't think we need to assign fault or blame at all. I think this is a cultural change, and it's very pervasive. It could be that 50-year-olds now think they're better. They're better than everybody else, more than 50-year-olds used to. That's very, very possible. So this is a generational shift, but it is also a shift that has really permeated our whole culture. And so I don't think we can necessarily point fingers at just the young generation. The Great Inflation is a good example of that principle that maybe the students were arguing over their grades, but so were their parents. And so were the teachers who thought, well, that might make the kid feel good to get an A.
I have one hopeful note to add to this. My younger daughter, who is a year out of college and is living with me and preparing to move on with her life, she brought all this stuff back from college and high school and all this stuff, we're going through it. And she opened up a box of her trophies, She was always she was a dancer, she did all kinds of things. And these I'm throwing away because they're just, for participation. I'm keeping the ones that are for real accomplishment. And so to come back to Alan Bloom, if I may, what I think is, as we worked on this book and we worked with our contributors and now we listen to this sort of litany of bad news, there's one thing that I take away from this encounter with my daughter that I think is hopeful, and that is that there is a human instinct, and this is something that Bloom focuses on, to honor and appreciate excellence and greatness. Our culture, which has the emphasis on equality, which has moved through American history with great power, as any profound philosophical principle will do, has eroded or undermined respect for genuine greatness, and we don't see it reflected in our education, in our culture, in our daily conversation. And yet, the human being still retains a respect for it. And so if there's, as I said, we're not long on solutions, but I personally feel that this is something that can be built upon, can be appealed to, and is something that we as conservatives of various stripes really should make a consistent focus of our speaking, our writing, our teaching. And so with that, I would love to open the floor to questions. Please.
Question for Mark.
We're going to bring a microphone to you.
Thank you, Jeff Steele with the American Legion. Question for Mark. Whether of your graphs could be seen as a measuring of what's being measured. In other words, were the number of people measured significantly larger over the period, or were they always the same number of people?
Did you mean Gene's graphs?
No, yours.
The IQ stuff, the cultural IQ stuff. She did it verbally, but I translated it into words.
Okay. No, I don't think that it's a function of the sample size. I think that's roughly consistent. And I would say also about the NAEP exams, the SAT has gone up. Actually, in recent years, the SAT number has gone down a little bit. In fact, and the same trend holds for the sliding scores. So I think we're good on the N.
Thanks for kicking the tires, though. Please, can you bring the mic? Thanks.
First of all, thank you. It's been very, very informative. The title of this was Anti-Intellectualism. I wonder whether in the country you're sensing almost a hostility towards intellectualism, towards thinking, whether that's now viewed as elitist, as coastal, just a general feeling.
I guess, yes, please.
Oh, tell you that if you look at some of these big surveys that have been done of young people, high school and college students, there is an enormous decline in the percentage read books on a regular basis. So that's just one example, which I'm sure the rest of the panel can build on.
And it's not just among the kids, it's among everybody. And it's a threat most immediately to newspapers and publishing houses, but it's a threat to our common ability to have a civic society and a political system that functions.
One quick survey figure, in 2000, half of American adults said that they read a newspaper the previous day. That could be print or digital. That number's down to 23% now.
I think there's also a sense in which a couple of things occur to me. First of all, intellectualism is hard, and we have a culture today that really shies away from the kind of effort. I mean, again, I have to say, I grew up among people who were really intellectuals, accomplished people, and I understood that in order to participate in a conversation with them, I had to know something. My opinion wasn't valued just because I was there, and that's gone now. Sir?
Would the adoption of religious norms help address this political correctness and moral relativism, and actually a little, and also maybe the extolling the individual because of their pure mind without cultural norms? So do we have to go back to the old-time religion? Or should we go? Yeah, go back to the old-time religion.
Well, I don't know how we would do that. Does anyone have an idea? Daniel, you're the yeah. We've done it before. These things do happen. They go in waves. I guess my personal response. I come back to the story that I told about my daughter. I think that I think young people naturally want some guidance, structure, authority, a sense of grown-ups being in charge. And allowing that in a sort of a living, coming into a world that is ordered and run by mature people. I don't see a lot of that today myself, but I have some hope that may work itself through.
I would welcome a third Great Awakening.
Mm-hmm. I would add, I think that religion does face certain in our current culture that are perhaps not the same obstacles faced by other forms of information. That's because there is a sort of a government policy arising out of what I would call a crabbed interpretation of the Establishment Clause that seeks to sort of exclude discussions of religion from the public square. So I think it's a little bit of a unique circumstance when it comes to discussions about especially Christianity and the Bible.
Such a wealth of interest. Please, over here.
So about Bernardo Rico, World Bank. 26 years ago, I was a senior in college, business major, and I read the book, Closing of the American Mind, and I think your father's introduction was probably just as good as the book. One of the things that really struck me and almost wanted me to change my major, and my father said, if you change your major to philosophy, which is what I wanted to do, I'm going to community college. And that's the dichotomy between American industriousness, which is kind of in line with American political conservative, and the teaching of the classics, which was one of the biggest points, I think, of the book, which I'm not sure if it's addressed really in this book. The panel was fantastic, but that was kind of the resounding message to me anyhow when I read the book 26 years ago. So I'm just wondering how much of an impact, well, that kind of dichotomy, how do you think it will play out going forward, American conservatives being people like myself who go to business school but don't necessarily have learn the classics, do it themselves on their own later on, the general teaching of the classics and the dumbing of the American mind in that sense.
We need to spread J. Paul Getty's policy of hiring a lot of classics majors. asked, "Why do you do that?" He said, "They sell more oil."
In the back, all the way.
Yeah. I'm Cole Aronson. I'm an intern at AEI. So a number of somebody, I think it may have been Mr. Bauerlein, is that how you say your last name? Listed a series of sort of principles of American society, civic virtue, individualism, limited government, etc. A number of scholars, probably most famously Alistair McIntyre in recent years, have suggested that the principles of classical liberalism are actually not particularly reconcilable with a Christian view of the natural person that I'm sorry, I can't read your Dreibach, I think may have been alluding to. Do we have to sacrifice classical liberalism in order to recover a sort of view of the person as having a moral place in the world that can answer this kind of relativistic view I think Professor Bloom was talking about in The Closing of the American Mind? And what does that mean for American conservatives, many of whom are classical liberals?
Anybody want to take that one up? Would you like to write a book on that subject? Maybe you should answer that question. What do you think? I don't know. Well, why are you looking at me? Well, it's an excellent question. I'm afraid you've sort of stumped us, but it's a very profound question. I honestly don't know the answer to it, but it's definitely worth thinking about, and maybe there should be a book on it. Down here, please.
Clay Ramsey, Program for Public Consultation at the University of Maryland, and this is directed to Professor Twenga, and it's in the category of, you mentioned earlier that you're perhaps a bit short on remedies, and this is in the remedy area. I read in the Financial Times of research, which I believe is business management research, about the term competence as opposed to more high-flown kind of language about excellence in being a champion and so forth. There's an entire Lucy Kellaway piece about this piece of research. As I recall it, they found that those who aspired to being competent at something, rather than checking the box that they were aspiring to be the best at something, wound up performing the tasks better than the people who were trying to be good. So I'm wondering whether competence is a value that can be pushed forward in the pantheon of American values in a way that it hasn't been in a long time, because we've are trying to be all these other things. You can't get hired by saying you're competent. You don't write in your resume that you're competent. But I think a lot of people are feeling that there's often a dearth of competence now in American life, and so I'm really asking you whether you might have run across this in the literature that you look at, and then more broadly whether you think this might be an interesting angle.
Yeah, I mean, it suggests we still have a lot to learn about motivation, because there's certainly other psychological studies suggesting that if you go into something and you say, I just don't want to fail, as opposed to I want to do really well, those who say I want to do really well are usually doing better. But it is true that if you think of excellence as perhaps being the top 1% or the top, we do have to accept as a society that not everybody is going to be excellent, and that's okay. So to have an acceptance for being average, that being average isn't always bad. And I would also put out there that competence is a much better bar than participation. And it's a much better bar than you're special just for being you. So it's a good place to start. And if that is more motivating, all the better.
And Michael Dukakis would be very happy to hear that. Yeah.
I'm bothered that our panel didn't offer a response to Cole Aronson's excellent question. And so anti-intellectualism in America up here on the panel. I'm a numbers boy, not a Committee on Social Thought boy, but I got to take a crack at your question. I think that the distinction between classical liberalism and a more biblical interpretation of the virtues may be a little overblown. It is true that if you talk about objectivism and you mean classical liberalism by Ayn Rand, that you have a little bit of problem with the texts. That is true. Objectivism is a freak show. If you want to talk about classical liberalism and get back to the texts and get back to Hayek or Adam Smith or get to John Locke, you see much more of a consonance between the moral presumptions that I think underlie those texts and those ways of thinking, and so that of course there's a tension there, but there's not a war.
Judge, you mentioned Adam Smith. Remember that Adam Smith does the economics. Also, he writes A Theory of Moral Sentiments. Okay. Right.
Yeah. Please.
I'm Juliana Pilan. I have 3 degrees in philosophy from the University of Chicago. So I could say that this is music to my ears, with a caveat that it's more like a requiem. I also want to say that your father was one of the best professors in the Committee on Social Thought, in addition to being a novelist. And those of us who had the pleasure of listening to him, he wouldn't lecture, he would just talk. It was extraordinary. I do want to not continue a kvetching session, although that would be very, very easy. The idea that there are some positive light of this very distressing tunnel appeals to me. And I want to say that among my most enjoyable experiences as a professor, I should have said I'm with the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, so there has to be some hope here. But some of my most enjoyable experiences have involved teaching Army colonels and lower rank as well, but the veteran community is an extraordinary pool of not only, patriotic, highly motivated, non-narcissists who love to read literature. And I commend to all of you the interview recently with General Stavridis. I think that we have a lot of people here who may not be able to write all that well initially, although they're quick learners. I think that this country will survive in greatness. We are, yes, an exceptional nation. And thank you so much for this magnificent panel. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And I think, I think we have time for one more. So right here, please.
Sunil Chacko, University of Alberta. Hello, Nick. And question to Nick and Jean. Given that much of the world looks to America for leadership, what probability do you see of these trends spreading worldwide? And is there a preventive for that?
Sure. Well, certainly indications seem to suggest that this particular brand of American individualism is spreading. A lot of other countries are starting from a much lower bar, which is probably why they're occasionally eating our economic lunch. So it does seem that it's spreading, though. I mean, just like McDonald's and Coca-Cola, this idea of thinking highly of yourself, focus on the self instead of social rules, which has some advantages as well, like equality, does seem to be spreading for good or for ill to the rest of the world reasonably quickly.
I suppose the the fortunate fact is that an awful lot of other countries see the U.S. as having a penurious and stingy welfare state, and I guess I'd kind of like to keep it that way. Some countries have had premature welfare states, like Argentina and other Latin American countries, and they've taken a little, kind of like time off from the world economy as a there are aspects of the American experience that I think other countries are going to emulate, but I don't think, for better or ill, the social entitlement state is going to be foremost among these.
And with that, thank you all very, very much. Thanks to the panel.